Hello everyone. Today's notes are on solving equations with factoring. So we're going to be using all of the factoring techniques that we've been working on and use them to solve specific types of equations. And we're going to get more into how these equations help us with something called parabolas and quadratic equations a little bit later. So the first idea we need to know is the zero product property. What the zero product property says is that A times B equals 0, then either A equals 0 or B equals 0. What that means is if I'm thinking of two different numbers and I tell you that if I multiplied those two numbers, I'd get an answer of 0, then you know that one of the numbers I'm thinking about has to be a 0. The only way two numbers can multiply to 0 is if one of them is a 0. This is not true for any other number. It's not like if you have two numbers that multiply to 2, one of them has to be a 2, because it doesn't. It's only true for 0. So we're going to use this idea to help us solve equations. So here's the steps that we're going to take, and we're going to go over 4 different problems. Step 1, we're going to set the equation equal to 0. In the situations that we're going to have over the next 2 days, they're already going to say equal 0. Step 2, we're going to factor. So we're going to use our factoring flowchart. Step 3, we're going to set both factors, so we're going to have the two sets of parentheses, both factors equal to 0. So now we're going to have two small equations and we're going to solve both of them. And then at the end, we're going to write our answer as a set. So we're going to use the braces and we're going to put 2 or maybe 1 or maybe no answers depending on what the problem needs. So let's look at problem number 1. This first problem is already factored for you because I wanted you to see how this works. So if I have something like x plus 3 times x minus 7 equals 0, then I know that either this set of parentheses or this set of parentheses has to be a 0, because the only way that those two can multiply to 0 is if one of them is a 0. So what you do is you separate them and you either say that either the x plus 3 equals the 0 or the x minus 7 equals the 0. So this is the step 3, essentially. I've set both factors equal to 0. So now I have two small equations, and I'm going to solve them. So I'm going to, on the left-hand side, I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides, and I'm going to get x equals negative 3. And on the right-hand equation, I'm going to add 7 to both sides, and I'm going to get x equals 7, which means that my answer is the set that includes the number negative 3 and 7. And I've written my set in order from least to greatest because that's the order sets should be written in. So let's try another one where we actually need to factor first. So this one says x squared plus 3x minus 10 equals 0. So first of all, it says 0, which is good. There are 3 terms. There is no GCF, by the way. There are 3 terms. The coefficient of x squared, which is a, is a 1, which means all we need is a diamond. So we're trying to find two numbers that multiply to negative 10 and add to 3. Those two numbers happen to be negative 2 and 5. So this is our factoring of our diamond problem, which means that if I were to have factored that problem, I would get x minus 2 times x plus 5. But since it's in an equation, I still have this equal 0 part. So I need to make sure it still says equal 0. So now I have two factors that multiply to 0. So if two things multiply to 0, one of them has to be a 0. So I'm going to separate my two factors and set them both equal to 0. And then I'm going to solve both of my factors. So on my first one, I'm going to add 2. And I'm going to get one of the options is that x equals 2. And on the other one, I'm going to subtract 5. And I'm going to get the option that x equals negative 5. Which means my answer is the set of numbers that includes negative 5 and 2. So those are the only two numbers that if I plugged them in for x at the original equation, I could get an answer of 0. So there's actually two answers that give us an answer of 0. Okay, let's try another one. X squared minus 4 equals 0. So going through our factoring flowchart, there is no GCF. There are two terms. So the only way we could factor this is if it is a difference of two squares. So this is an x squared, and this is a 2 squared, because 2 times 2 is 4. So remember, a difference of two squares, we have a plus and a minus binomial. And the things that were squared are what go into our difference of two squares. So we have x plus 2 times x minus 2, and it equals 0. So if two things multiply to 0, one of them has to be a 0. So we separate our two factors, and we make them both equal to 0, and then we solve them, and we get x equals negative 2 as one option, and we get x equals positive 2 as our second option, which means that the set of answers are negative 2 and 2. So those are our two possible answers to get x equals 0. Because 2 squared is 4, minus 4 is 0, and negative 2 squared is also 4, minus 4 is 0. Okay, let's try one more. 3x squared plus 13x minus 10 equals 0. So it already says equals 0. There is no GCF. There are three terms. The coefficient of x squared, which is a, is not a 1, which means we need a diamond and a box. Do not forget your factoring flowchart. I'm just verbally going over it right now. Okay, the very top of our diamond is going to be 3 times negative 10. Remember that since a doesn't equal 0, it's a times 1. It is a times c, so that is a negative 30. The middle term is what it needs to add to. So the two numbers that multiply to negative 30 and add to 13 would be 15 and negative 2. So in the upper left-hand corner of our box, it's always the squared term, so 3x squared. The bottom right is always the constant, so negative 10. And then the two numbers we just found go in the other diagonal, and they go with x's. And if you had switched your 15 and negative 2, it's the same answer, and you're fine. So the GCF of the first column, the 3x squared and the 15x, is a 3x. They are both multiples of 3, and they have an x. The second column, the negative 2x and the negative 10, have a negative 2 in common. The first row has only an x in common because 3 and 2 do not have a common divisor other than 1. And negative 10x and 15x have a 5 in common, which means my factored answer is 3x minus 2 times x plus 5, and it still equals 0. Okay, I'm going to move this over here because I'm going to need some space. Okay, then we do the part where if two factors multiply to 0, then one of them has to equal 0. So I'm going to separate this and have them separately equal to 0. Now, one of the reasons I'm doing this problem is so that you know that sometimes your answers are fractions, and that's okay. Because on this first factor, I'm going to add 2 to both sides. I'm going to get 3x equals 2. I'm going to divide both sides by 3. And remember, if you show your work, your fractional answer shows up. So our answer for this one is 2/3. For the other one, if I subtract 5 from both sides, I get negative 5, a normal integer. So that means that my two possible answers are negative 5 and 2/3. So we are factoring, we are setting our two factors equal to 0, and we are solving them. So we're adding one extra step to all of our factoring work. Okay, so your word of the day is 0, because 0 is very special. If you have two things that multiply to 0, one of them has to be a 0. Your assignment is solving equations with factoring part 1, and tomorrow will be part 2. If you have any questions, stop by virtual office hours on Wednesday or Thursday. Email me, private message me. Do not forget to get your attendance done this week before Friday morning so that I know that you still exist somewhere out there and are doing some work. Have a great day.